Hello, everybody, and welcome into a very special edition of the Couch GMs podcast. As always, I'm joined by the two best friends that anyone could ask for, Tyler Snyder.
Hello.
And Cody Roadcap.
How's it going?
And today we have a very special guest from the First and 10 Club podcast. Welcome in Marc D. Marc, how you doing?
Hey, guys. How are you?
Doing all right. Better if the Titans would have beat the Bengals, but...
I feel like there was a lot of upsets this week that we'll talk about later. But this is your first time checking out the Couch GMs podcast. Thank you. A little bit about us. George, Tyler, and myself are three best friends who met in college, talk football every day, and we just want to make a show to entertain you guys. But that's enough about us. So let's talk about our special guest, the one and only Marc D. Tell us a little about yourself, your show, and where people can find you.
My name is Marc D from the First and 10 Club, and kind of like you guys, I am a super fan of the NFL, and my show is devoted to the fans' take of news, notes, games picks. I think sometimes the experts out there just won't say what needs to be said. So I have no filter. I'm not afraid to say what's on my mind. You can check me out on my YouTube channel. Just search Marc D or the First and 10 Club, and you can find me on Twitter at First and 10 Club, club spelled CUCLU1.
All right, guys, you heard it here. That's Marc with a C. And today we have a very special edition of the Couch GMs podcast. Today we're going to go over all of the AFC teams, kind of talk about where they're at right now in the season, whether they're able to still make the playoffs, what we can expect from those teams. And we're also going to do a fantasy redraft later in the show. If we were able to redo the first round of fantasy drafts right now, who would our 12 guys be? So, guys, let's get right into it. We're going to start off with the AFC North. Cody, tell us about the Bengals.
All right, so the Bengals, they just come off a big win against the Titans. Sorry, Tyler, but you mentioned it earlier.
I don't want to talk about it.
You know, they got their pick right. Joe Burrow looks legit. They have a lot of offensive weapons, but what they really need going into next year, they're not competing this year. Next year, they're going to need some defensive help. That defense is low tier in the NFL, just not where it needs to be a contender. Hopefully next year they can get there, but I think they'll look to play spoiler with some tough teams in their division coming up down the stretch of the season.
Yeah, Cody, I don't really want to talk about the Bengals after that horrible loss the Titans had to them. However, hopefully the Titans will be able to bounce back from that loss. So let's move on to another AFC North team, and I will go with the Browns. So the Cleveland Browns, I mean, what a story. They are always the underdog. They've been horrible for years, and finally they look like they might actually be a contender. Baker Mayfield is the best quarterback at making commercials in the league. He's better than Aaron Rodgers and Patrick Mahomes at making commercials. Fight me on it. But honestly, Baker Mayfield looked like he took a step up this year. He looks like he's performing a lot better. They do still have a pretty great defense there in Cleveland. They have some up and down games. They are missing Odell for the rest of the year, but they seem to like Rashard Higgins, think he can step up. They're going to use that rookie tight end more. I really think the Browns are going to have a chance to make a good run in the playoffs. I really think they have a solid team. They just have to get some consistency. They just have to start playing better together and minimize the penalties. Yeah, guys, I think the Browns are really a contender this year.
Yeah, Tyler, I kind of have to agree with you there. And I got to give the Browns a mulligan for this, past week. The weather that they experienced against the Raiders was just unworldly. If you didn't get a chance to take a look at the missed field goal, uh, it's YouTube, and it's definitely worth a watch. But the Browns are, I think they're a better team without OBJ there. Those who watch my show know I'm not a fan of OBJ, but I think Baker Mayfield does what he has always done best without OBJ on the field, which is spread the ball around and basically service that offense by finding the open look. And I think you're going to see more of that. I think you're going to see the Browns surprise a lot of teams this year.
Okay, so Marcus, with that being said, are there any of the Browns' remaining receivers that you would like to own in fantasy? Do you trust any of them?
Oh, I definitely, honestly, I would say the receiver I trust the most in Cleveland is Higgins. I think moving forward, he is going to be the most featured wide receiver. And the reason why I say that is now because of OBJ being gone, Landry's going to start to see more attention and see more of the double teams. So Higgins is more than capable. He's proven that in the past, and he has a really good rapport with Baker Mayfield. So I think it's a sneaky stash if you're playing fantasy to go out and grab him, especially if he is on the waiver wire after last week. I don't think anyone's rushing out there to get him. So go ahead, pick him up, and start him with confidence.
So, speaking about wide receivers, there's one team in that division that has had some really good fantasy receivers this year, and that is the Steelers. Marcus, what is your take on the Steelers this year?
So we talk about going into the season about the one last ride quarterbacks. You had Brady in Tampa Bay and Breeze in the New Orleans Saints, and everyone kind of overlooked Ben Roethlisberger. There was a lot of people who thought that he might be done. And in all honesty, he could be in contention for comeback player of the year. But what's really scary this year is it's like Pittsburgh figured it out that they can lean on the defense. This defense almost carried a team without Roethlisberger to the playoffs last year. Now Roethlisberger's there. He's just doing what has to be done to win games. And that's find the open receivers. They're not even using possibly their best wide receiver in Juju Smith-Schuster to his full capacity because they have so many offensive weapons.
Yeah, Marcus, I think you make some great points about the receivers. And I think Juju is also a fun name to look at going forward. I personally don't think he'll be on this team next year because of the younger talent they have behind them. And to your point on the defense, their defense has been incredible. Picking up Mike or Minka Fitzpatrick last year seems to really have taken that defense to a whole new level and possibly could take him all the way this season.
All right, so there's one team left in the AFC North, and that is the Baltimore Ravens. Now, they were one of the highest talked about teams coming into this season, a potential Super Bowl favorite, but they have had a bit of an up and down season. So, George, what do you think about the Ravens and their chances this year?
Ravens are absolutely a great team, and they are definitely the biggest fight to the Steelers to actually take that division. But it does concerning now that the Steelers have 2 games on them. I think the real big concerns are first off, that offensive line. They had a couple injuries this week. The biggest one would be Ronnie Stanley, their tackle, who they just extended, gave a huge deal to. Broken ankle, he's out for the year. And I feel like I have to talk a little bit about Lamar Jackson. Lamar is probably one of the most talented quarterbacks in the league, but his passing has always come into question, and that obviously has questions when they're down in games. Can they actually come back if they have to throw the ball 50 times a game? While I don't think having to throw the ball 50 times a game is, actually, you know, possible for them, they did come back from behind a little bit against Pittsburgh this week. There was a lot of concerns because Lamar turned the ball over a lot, and their play calling did kind of give me some head scratching. Um, Sometimes of head scratching. There was plenty of times where, like, 3rd and 8, they run the ball. I don't know if it's just because they had so much success, but you have to trust Lamar to throw the ball in certain situations, even if he is struggling. That's not going to help him progress at all. Um, I think you need to see more out of him to finish off this season if you want to see them make a playoff run. They are definitely a playoff team. They have a chance if they beat Pittsburgh on Thanksgiving to come up and win that division, but there's just some question marks to go with them if you want to actually put them in the Super Bowl contender category.
You know, this might be a really hot take, but I'll be perfectly honest. I think Lamar Jackson is just an exceptionally phenomenal athlete that can throw a football. I think there's a difference between a mobile quarterback and a running quarterback. And I think Lamar Jackson mirrors very much like his backup in RG3. And the unfortunate thing is, and honestly, more appropriately, when an injury happens or as he gets older, he's going to become less and less viable as a quarterback. So I'm going to pose a question to the Couch GMs here. A little fun thing. If you were starting a team today, and you had the option between Joe Burrow as your quarterback or Lamar Jackson, who are you taking?
I'll go ahead and take that one. I have been, you know, one of the biggest naysayers of Lamar Jackson since he originally got drafted. And my reason for that was actually the same as you, Marcus. I thought he was going to get hurt. Um, he's such a mobile quarterback. He's going to take a lot more hits. He's not going to be able to withstand the amount of hits that he's going to take in a season. But honestly, my fear with him is not the injuries, it's actually his arm. When he is ahead in a game and he is able to make a throw with plenty of time, no pressure, he's good. But later in a game, when he is behind and he is forced to throw to try to come back and win the game, he can't get it done. I really don't believe he can. We've seen it against the Chiefs. We've seen it against the Titans in the playoffs last year, and even a little bit against the Steelers this past week. When he's forced to throw, he can't seem to get that done. Joe Burrow, however, can. He might not be the mobile quarterback. He might not be able to be as dynamic or as exciting as Lamar Jackson, but he can make the throws when he needs to. So if I had to start a team this year and I got to pick one of those two, I would take Joe Burrow 10 times out of 10.
Okay.
And I just want to add to your point there. I was probably, of the group of us, I don't fully know Marcus's opinion, but I was probably the biggest Lamar fan coming into. I thought he was going to be a solid NFL quarterback, and I still do. But to answer your specific question, I do think the Joe Burrow versus Lamar Jackson is Lamar needs a certain type of team around him, where I think Joe Burrow you can put on any team and his skills would translate. So if I was starting a team, I would also take Joe Burrow.
I'll jump on that, Cody. I mean, I think agreed. You do have to have a certain type of team around Lamar, but at the same time, you kind of can add some pieces around him to make him better, and it might not be pieces that he's had. Like, I feel like he's never really had a really key number one receiver. As good as Hollywood Brown is, I don't know if he's ever had that. And I heard somebody make an argument this weekend that I kind of liked, and that's he never really had a mentor. He had Joe Flacco in the house for the first, season he was there when he started half of it. And I don't mean Joe Flacco never really impressed me. I don't know about you guys, but maybe it's taken him longer to come along because his only real mentor is the coach. He doesn't have that player in house to with the experience to help him see what he's looking at. So maybe that's part of it. But why don't we move on here to the AFC East and let's talk about what might be the laughing stock of the league. Marcus, why don't you give us a little rundown on the New York Jets?
My love-hate relationship for the New York Jets. I don't even know if you can call this an NFL franchise at this point anymore. Uh, Today, it came out that the GM, Douglas, tried to make a play that Gase is an important and integral part of the future of the New York Jets. Well, I think he needs a wake-up call for starters because I'm not sure Douglas is an integral part of the future of the New York Jets. If the ownership has half of a brain, both of them should already be out. They should take a page from the Atlanta Falcons playbook. But, most teams in the situation that the Jets are, they have a plan. Whether you never say you're tanking, but at least you have a positive outlook as, all right, we have a future for us. The problem here is you have possibly the worst coach, the worst GM in the NFL, and the team has just quit. In all facets, I honestly believe this team has just quit. When you are down against Kansas City, yes, I understand you're probably not going to win that game. I don't think they're good enough to win any game this year. But you just keep running the ball over and over in the second half when you're down. That's quitting to me. That's basically giving up and running the ball. And on top of it, you're not even running the ball with youth, people that you want to see what potential there might be. You're running it with the geriatric running back in Frank Gore, who had an incredible career, but his time has gone. It's time for that pony to be taken to the glue factory. And I feel bad for Sam Darnold and Jamison Crowder because what's left of their career and Sam Darnold, his career is just being ruined in New York. And I feel bad for whoever has to go there via the draft.
Maybe with the Jets situation and the GM's comments, maybe Adam Gase is integral in their future, integral in getting them the number one pick so they can draft Trevor Lawrence, who will probably say, I'm not coming to the Jets because who would want to at this point? But I do want to point out, I do think Sam Darnold's still a good quarterback. He needs a new change of scenery. I think you talked about the end of the road with the Steelers. I think you would make a great fit backing up Big Ben next year, maybe 2 years, and then taking over that Steelers team.
I'd like to see him in San Francisco, to be honest with you. I really don't think Jimmy Garoppolo's the guy, and I think Sam Darnold uh, really is a great quarterback. I think in that system he would thrive. I think he could make a deep playoff run with the San Francisco 49ers.
Man, I just heard Sam Bradford, and I had PTSD
Whew.
attacks as an Eagles fan.
Yeah, horrible. Horrible. Bad slip right there. But all right, guys, so let's move on to the Buffalo Bills. George, take it away. This is the team that you said you thought would win the Super Bowl this year coming in. How are you feeling about that now?
They're still a very good team, but the question I have is, where did Josh Allen go? He started the season looking like an MVP candidate, and all of a sudden he became almost irrelevant. They're still winning games that they should win. But I don't know what this team has to do to get back to working top form. I think they really need to let Zach Moss go and take over that running backfield. Devin Singletary, as much of a Devin Singletary fan as I am, I think he just doesn't quite have that top back pedigree. He needs to give it to Zach Moss. They both had about the same amount of carries last week, and Moss looked very good. Um, I think they have to realize that Josh Allen can't do it all yet. He's still only in his third season. He's only 24 years old. Maybe they're trying to give him too much because they got too confident with how the start he had, and now he's being asked to do too much and he's struggling for that reason. Maybe they need to have him run the ball a little bit more. People forget that he's a running quarterback because he doesn't really look like it, but it's a big part of his game. I still think they have a good chance. Their defense is very good. Their coaching is very good. They're going to win that division because the only real competition they have is Miami. And starting a rookie quarterback, I can't really say that they're going to make a run at Buffalo. But to make a deep playoff run, they need to see Josh Allen go back to the form he was having the first 3 weeks.
Yeah, George, I agree with you about Josh Allen, but I'm going to ask the question as to where did the defense go? You said that they're a good defense, and you're right, they are a good defense, but this used to be a great defense. And they've been very susceptible to pretty much big plays. They've been very, very ineffective on making those key stops that they were so good at last year. Um, I don't know if that's the curse of Josh Norman being part of the franchise now, um, but I think that's what's hurting them more than Josh Allen's play per se.
I mean, I think part of it's Josh Norman has to get his feet back on the ground after that Derrick Henry stiff arm. I think he's still flying around the stadium.
He has not landed.
He has
Source
not landed.
confirms he has not landed yet.
No, but in seriousness, no, they definitely do have to get it back together. There's too much talent on that defense for me to think that it can't come up big when it gets to December football in the cold, wintry Buffalo air in a playoff game. I mean, they're at least going to have one home playoff game outside in that brisk cold and potential snow, and that's really going to favor their running game and their defense. So, as much as, yeah, they're not coming up as clutch as they were last year, I still think they're going to be okay, and they still have half a season to get it back together. So, I don't know. I mean, you're right, definitely, but I think they'll be okay.
So you mentioned earlier that the only real competition for the Bills right now is Miami because they are in second place in the division, which is pretty interesting to say that about the Patriots, not having a chance. They're a team that you always just kind of expect to win the division. So I'm interested to hear Cody's take on the Patriots, but I will start on the Dolphins. Uh, you know, how does Ryan Fitzpatrick play as well as he does and get benched? I understand if the Dolphins were out of playoff contention. They're just trying to worry about next season. So, you know what? Might as well throw Tua in there, get him some work before he has to play meaningful football next year. But they're playing meaningful football right now, especially with the added playoff team in each conference. The Dolphins do still have a shot at the playoffs. There was no reason to bench Fitzpatrick. I can talk today. He played 6 games, had a 70% completion percentage, 1,500 yards, 10 touchdowns, 7 interceptions. Now, granted, I understand the 7 interceptions is a bit alarming. A lot of those came late in games when he's just airing it out to try to have any kind of last hope. So you can't really hang on those 7 interceptions too hard. But the Miami Dolphins are still in contention, and now they put in Tua, who didn't look too great this past week. However, um, the Miami defense and special teams did enough that he really didn't need to even play for them to win. But I still think the Dolphins are a pretender. I don't think that they're actually going to contend this year. I think that Tua is going to have a lot of growing pains. He's going to make a lot of rookie mistakes, and it's going to keep him out of the playoffs. However, I think Miami might be closer to being a serious playoff team than we originally thought. We thought it would take 4 or 5 years for them to build back from how bad they were last season, and they're already playing some pretty good football. So I would look at Miami to actually have some strong playoff contentions next season already.
I'm actually going to disagree with you there. I do think they have potential to be in the playoffs this year, and maybe that's just because I'm a huge fan of Brian Flores. I think what he's done, and I understand why some people don't understand the Fitzpatrick move, but I think it was the time was right with the bye week. He wanted to get Tua in there. Fitzpatrick always has that game where he looks atrocious, and they wanted to beat the clock before that happened. So I do think Tua in there growing this year will not only help him the rest of season, but like you said, going forward. But I can wrap up the AFC East with the Patriots. And guys, I think it's safe to say the dynasty is over. I
Hallelujah.
think with
Finally.
about time. But they had the league high 8 players opt out this year. Their quarterback Cam Newton was on the COVID list. He looked good. Now he doesn't look very good, whether that's COVID related or just the league quickly caught up to the new running style of offense. Their lack of playmakers. I think they're pretty much done for this season, and I wouldn't be surprised if they have a top 5 pick, maybe top 10, and are looking at one of the top quarterbacks in the draft this year. I do think, though, as long as Bill Belichick is there, this team will rebound quickly, and I don't expect them to stay down for too long.
It's funny you say that the New England dynasty is over. I, I have to disagree with that because, as sickening as it is to me, I look at this season as a year hiatus for their dynasty. And I was afraid of this coming into the season when you start to see all the players opt out. And even with Cam Newton there, they're still a one dimensional team. They're a running team. They don't have a passing attack, they don't have wide receivers. And just like you said, Cody, they're looking to project into a top 5 pick. And you can't tell me that New England is not willing to do what it takes to get whoever they want at the top of the draft. Can you imagine, as it would sicken me, if they somehow put a package together or some way and Lawrence ends up as a New England Patriot?
I got to say, it has shades of Indianapolis for me. I remember, being a Titans fan, having to watch us play the Colts and get dominated year after year, watching them go from a guy like Peyton Manning, take 1 year off, and then get Andrew Luck. It was just sickening. So I could definitely see something like that happening in New England. It would be painful to see. Um, but, with Indianapolis being mentioned, Cody, why don't you give us a little insight on what you think you could see from the Colts the rest of this season?
All right, so I'm going to say the Colts, they're a pretender. I know me and Marcus went back on this a little bit at the beginning of the season when he was their Super Bowl pick, but I think Philip Rivers has essentially been done in the NFL for 3 seasons now. And I think their defense is good, but their quality of opponents or quality of quarterbacks they've played to this point might make them appear better on paper than they actually are. I'm excited to see them play some more talented teams coming forward. Luckily, they still get to play the Jags again, the Texans, all the other bad teams in that division. So I think the Colts are pretenders. I just don't think they're very good yet. They're another team. I don't think they'll end up high enough for a draft pick of a quarterback, but I think they're going to try again next year with a new quarterback instead of Philip Rivers.
What do you think of Jacoby Brissett? Do you think that he should deserve to get a starting job somewhere, or do you think he's going to be a career backup?
At this point, he's probably a career backup, but I said at the beginning of the season, and I'll say it again now, I don't think the difference between Philip Rivers and Jacoby Brissett is much different at Philip Rivers' state in his career.
Okay. All right, definitely an interesting take there. So let's go on to a team that is definitely not competing this year. Gardner Minshew is said to be out in this upcoming week. They are going with Luton as their new quarterback, a sixth round draft pick. George, give me some insight on the Jaguars.
This whole Luton thing sounds a lot like what happened with Gardner Minshew last year, coming in for an injury on Nick Foles. He's this unknown guy and becomes this big star. I'm not saying Luton's going to be a big star, but no, Gardner Minshew I think is the big thing when it comes to the Jaguars for the rest of this season. As you said, they're out of contention. The rest of the season needs to be them figuring out if Gardner Minshew is their top quarterback for years to come. They should have a top 7 pick in the draft. They can either turn that for a higher pick and grab a quarterback, or they're still going to have some decent quarterbacks on the board there in the early first round. But I don't think they're really that bad of a team outside of it. They did lose a lot of defensive pieces since their AFC championship run 3 years ago, so they're going to have to rebuild the defense a little bit. But I love the rest of their offense. Their running backs are good. Their wide receiver core is underrated. DJ Chark is a stud. Keelan Cole and Chris Conley look really good. And Laviska Shenault, which is Tyler's man crush, it seems like, is super impressive as a rookie straight out. He can run every route. He can do everything. So there's a lot to look forward to in Jacksonville, but the quarterback position is still a big question mark, and I'm not convinced Gardner Minshew is their long-term answer.
Okay, George. So, for all the fantasy players that are listening to this show, you just mentioned all those great receivers that Jacksonville has. Do you feel confident starting any of them in fantasy this week without Gardner Minshew there?
GJ Chark is the number one. He's the guy that's going to get the most volume. He would probably still be a decent play. I think the rest are just too hit and miss or split too many targets for me to feel confident without Gardner Minshew in there. So I would say you probably could start Chark, but not the other three.
Yeah, I would disagree with you there, George. I think if you're going to start a wide receiver this week from Jacksonville, I'm going with Chenault. I think with Luton being the quarterback, you're going to see a creative play calling screen, and we all know how much of a Swiss Army knife he is. Whether it's with sweeps, whether it's with screens, I think he plays a bigger role for this week in the offense than Chark does.
And I just want to go back quick to the actual team going forward. And George, is Doug Marrone on the hot seat? I feel like he's been mentioned in years past, but he doesn't seem to have a too warm of a seat right now. But what do you think end of season? Is Doug Marrone still the coach?
We've been talking a lot about um, coaches that could get fired this week. I don't think he's on any kind of radar of he's week to week. I think he'll definitely finish off the season. But you've seen a lot of teams recently when they go out to think we're going to get a new quarterback, they try to get a coach to complement that quarterback so the coach gets his guy. I would not be shocked if you see Marrone go and they get a quarterback, kind of like what Arizona did with getting Cliff Kingsbury to go with Kyler Murray. So I think he might be gone if they decide to go in a new direction away from Gardner Minshew, but he's not going to be fired before the end of the season. His seat's not that warm. You're right.
Well, his seat might not be that warm, but there is one head coach in the division that was already fired, and that was Bill O'Brien, head coach slash GM. So, speaking of Bill O'Brien, speaking of the Texans, Marcus, give me a rundown on what you expect from them the rest of this season.
The interesting thing with the Houston Texans is they are a perfect example of why it is so dangerous to turn over the GM duties and head coaching duties to one person. What do I expect from the rest of the season? At best, you try and see what's there and figure out what's in your future plans. I think they had a golden opportunity at the trade deadline here to try and recoup as much draft capital as possible. But instead, you have your interim head coach, Romeo Crennel, who apparently is also acting as a GM or in some capacity along the lines of the duties of a GM, thinking every player he has there is solid gold. They failed to move anyone. They failed to make any plays. So you have a team that's, in my opinion, really in quicksand in terms of improving. And they don't have the ability to really to improve it. And the reason why I say that is, if you don't know, the Houston Texans don't have a first or second round draft pick next year. Those belong to the Miami Dolphins. They were part of the trade they used to acquire Laramie Tunsil. And now you have a team that is looking to have a lock for a top 5 pick, and it's going to go to an up and coming franchise to help that franchise improve and be better. So moving forward, the trades didn't happen now, but if I'm Houston, I'm looking at a complete strip down rebuild. And I think that's the only way you can go about it, because this team is not going to attend, or I'm sorry, this team is not going to contend for this season, and I don't believe they're going to contend for a few years to come here. So I have to wonder, really, why are you holding on to a player like Deshaun Watson, even, who is in his prime, who could bring you back that draft capital? He's not going to be a one-man show to turn your franchise around. It's shown this year that you have to have other pieces to complement him. This team's in a world of hurt, and I think they're going to have a very long and slow rebuild ahead of them. And unfortunately, I think they squandered some really great chances.
So how long do you think that them staying stagnant at the trade deadline here and not even trading someone like a Will Fuller who is gathering some value from other teams, how long do you think that delays their rebuild?
I mean, you still have the opportunity to make the moves in the offseason, but I think they had an opportunity here. Will Fuller is going to be a free agent. You can't trade a free agent. So I understand their asking price was a second round draft pick. I'm not 100% sure what Green Bay offered them, but you take what you can get. At some point, the market becomes what the market is, and you cut bait. I don't understand why or what the value is of keeping Will Fuller for this year. You're 1-6. You're completely out of contention in your division. I just don't see how it benefits your team moving forward. So to me, that's why I use the reference in quicksand. It's like they still think they have the chance to do something, or that they're right there on the cusp, and they're not.
I gotta say, as the resident Titans fan on this podcast, I am loving hearing the fact that you say the Colts still need a quarterback, the Jags are rebuilding, and the Texans are years away from being good. I love hearing that. That means the Titans are pretty much going to have the upper hand in the division for years to come, and I would love to see that. However, this year, they already had the upper hand in the division, and now they lost to the Bengals, but it's not just they lost. They looked bad. They got manhandled by a team that only had one win coming into the game, and that is not okay uh, for any team to be able to do that. Jonathan Joseph looked horrible. He was afraid to make a tackle. He stayed 10 yards off of every receiver, no matter the down and distance, and it burned us. The Titans had no corners. Our offensive line was so injured. Even Adam Humphries got injured in the game, and now, slot receiver is a complete opening. We have nothing in the middle of the field to throw to. So the Titans looked exposed. However, the Titans just cleaned house. The long snapper made a couple of bad snaps, so he got cut. Jonathan Joseph could not cover to save his life, so he got cut. And then you have Vic Beasley, the offseason signing that we were excited for that was supposed to finally give us a pass rush. He couldn't do it. He hasn't gotten any, even close to a sack on the season yet. He got cut. Titans are cleaning house, and then they trade a sixth round pick, which is nothing, for Desmond King, a 25-year-old former All Pro corner and returner. I love the move. Adoree Jackson should be coming back. I think the Titans are going to make a strong run at the playoffs late in the season. However, they do have a tough schedule. As far as are they Super Bowl contenders, that's going to be difficult to say. It all depends on if they can get the right coaching to get their defense squared away. because right now, whatever they're doing with that defense it's exposed. It looks bad.
You know, I have a question for you. One, I agree with you in terms of the defense being exposed. When you bring in Vic Beasley and Jadeveon Clowney, and at this point in the season, neither of them have a sack, that obviously is a problem. But I'm curious on your take. You said about the Titans cleaning house. Explain to me why Steven Gostkowski still has a job, or at least hasn't seen some sort of competition brought in.
That man's name is a curse word in my household. I don't love Steven Goskowski at all. I don't understand how a man can miss this many field goals in a season and still keep his job. I mean, I understand he missed another one this week, and you can make excuses about all of his kicks. And this one, it was heavy wind from 53 yards, and he doinked it. But he's missed so many field goals coming into the game that he shouldn't have even been getting the kicking chances to begin with. Now, I've had conversations about Goskowski with other people, and the only reason that I can give that he still has a job, other than the fact that we gave him a ridiculous contract at his age, was there's really no one available. There's really no kickers out there that you can bring in and trust right away. I mean, look at the Jaguars, for example. They have been desperate for a kicker, and every week they bring in someone new who does terrible and gets cut again. There's really not much on the free agent market um, until he really costs us a lot more games. I don't think Goskowski is going to lose his job. Sadly, I don't expect him to have the job next season, however.
Good point.
And before we wrap up with this division, I just want to say the Desmond King trade was my favorite trade of this pretty slow trade deadline. But that was my favorite trade. I think it was a great ad for Tennessee, and the value was incredible. But our last division is the AFC West, and we'll start with George. Haven't heard from you for a while, so let's break down the Broncos a little bit.
I think with the Broncos, we're looking at a team that is probably in the last year of its rebuild. I want to start with the defense. They had a absolutely dominant defense a few years ago, back when they were still had Peyton Manning and were going to the Super Bowl. That defense carried Peyton Manning to his last Super Bowl. And I think they might only be a couple of pieces away from getting to a defense that's good again. I love a lot of the pieces they have: Chubb, Jewel, Boye, Justin Simmons. When they finally let him play, they're really easing him in, which I don't quite understand why. But when he's been on the field, he's making plays. I remember a game a couple weeks ago. He only played 11 snaps and he got an interception. So I'm excited to see when he gets more snaps in the second half of the season. That defense is really coming together. Um, Offense, Drew Lock. I'll say I was one of the people that was not convinced that he was a starting quarterback in the league coming into this season. I thought he was all hype, but he's done a lot to show me that he could be a at least mid-tier starting quarterback in the league, and someone that they could potentially ride to some playoff runs. And their wide receiver core is super young and really looks promising. They have Cortland Sutton, who's obviously not playing this year with the injury, but Jerry Jeudy might be the second or third best wide receiver in this wide receiver class. I love KJ Hamler. He's underrated. I hope that's not just the Penn State fan in me coming out, but he just caught a game-winning touchdown pass this past week. Um, and maybe the most underrated wide receiver in the NFL, Timothy Michael Patrick. One Tim Patrick. Um, he's been on that team for years. He's finally getting a chance with some of the injuries and the young guys this year, and he's put up starting wide receiver stats. So, I mean, they have a lot of good pieces. They could be starting to come out of their rebuild next year. I don't think they're quite there, but they're getting close.
Yeah, and Denver got some good news. My understanding is there's some optimism that Von Miller might actually not be lost for the entire season. So depending what Denver does, and if they are in contention towards the end of the year, heading into playoffs, they might get a big defensive piece back in Von Miller. I just don't understand. The thing that confuses me with the Broncos yet is the affinity to not hand the ball off to the best running back in that backfield, and it's Philip Lindsay. Year after year, he proves it. He puts up the stats. He can make the runs. He's more explosive than Melvin Gordon, but yet he's still in a running back by committee. And I think that hurts the team. I think it holds him back.
I have noticed him start to get a big uptick in carries the last few weeks, though. I think maybe they started to realize that the offense was working better with him. I mean, I can't tell you they can't say they can totally phase out Melvin Gordon because he's no slouch. But I agree, Philip Lindsay is the future there. Philip Lindsay is the better back. Maybe they know they're not a playoff contender yet, and they're trying to save him a little bit, and that's why someone like Melvin Gordon's in there.
And also, Melvin Gordon was one of their big offseason acquisitions. And anytime you spend the money to go out and get a big name like that, you can't just sit him on the bench. You have to use him, or the fan base would riot. Um, I think that's another reason why Melvin Gordon gets so many carries.
Yeah, and I was just going to add on to that. I think, Lindsey does have a little bit of an injury history, so I agree with George on, trying to save him a little bit, let Melvin pound it out for a few yards or a couple drives just to save Lindsey, but he is definitely the more explosive. But another team that is kind of going through a rebuild and also struck with a bunch of injuries is the Los Angeles Chargers. Almost said San Diego, but it's the Los Angeles Chargers. Tyler, why don't you break down the Chargers for us?
The Chargers are exciting and frustrating all at the same time. As far as fantasy, they are the most frustrating team in the NFL. I would go as far as to say you can't understand what's going on with that backfield. When Austin Eckler was the starter, he was getting tons of yards and tons of points every time he touched the ball, and yet he couldn't get all the carries because they wanted to make sure Josh Kelly got his touches. So then Eckler goes down, and you're like, all right, Josh Kelly time. No, it's Justin Jackson. Justin Jackson gets all the carries. So you pick up Justin Jackson. You're like, fine, okay, he's the starter. Let's go with him. Then Josh Kelly finally starts getting the carries that you expected. So you start him again. And now Troy Pope comes out and he's the starter. I have no idea what's going on. And then on top of that, you also have the tight ends where you have Hunter Henry, one of the most exciting young tight ends in the NFL right now, and he gets no targets, no catches, but all the backup tight ends are catching touchdowns. I don't know what's going on fantasy wise with that team. They're a hard team to start anybody unless your name is Keenan Allen or Justin Herbert. But man, Justin Herbert, he looks great. He was not one of the top rookie quarterbacks talked about this season, but he is definitely playing like one. He is a candidate for rookie of the year, I would go as far as to say, and he looks exciting. And the issue with the Chargers is they can't seem to close out games. They are in every game. They have a lead in most games, but it gets to the fourth quarter and they blow it. They are a few fourth quarter good plays away from being one of the top teams in the division and being an AFC contender. Instead, they are sitting at a spot where they are, they might as well just keep rebuilding, go for next year because they just can't seem to pull off these games. Denver Bronco game this past week is a great example of that. They were leading big and they just let the Broncos inch back, and final play of the game, they got that touchdown to win it. And I think the Chargers have a bright future ahead of them, especially with a guy like Justin Herbert at the helm. But this year, man, they might just pack it in.
I want to go back to you talking about them from a fantasy perspective and specifically the tight ends. Um, I hate to say this because I'm a big fan of Hunter Henry, but it's been years since he's been drafted. He's had injury problems. It seems like there's this, that, the other thing. He was behind Antonio Gates for years. When do we finally say, is he a bust?
So for fantasy, I do think he's probably more on the bust side. But in fantasy there isn't very many Travis Kelsey, George Kittle tight ends. Every other tight end outside of the big two are weekly matchups, and this year he's just not reeling in on the plus matchups. So I guess from a what we think, we always think Hunter Henry fourth or fifth tight end off the board. He's not that guy. I do think going forward he will have streamable weeks. But I think that also leads into my point where I don't think he's a bust talent wise. I just don't think the Chargers offense makes a big emphasis on the tight end anymore since Rivers is gone and Gates is gone. Um, but maybe they will next year. And I actually want to loop back to Tyler. They keep losing all these close games. I asked it about the Jags. Is Anthony Lynn a coach that's on the potential hot seat?
I don't personally believe he is just yet. I think he definitely should be in the consideration for being on the hot seat. He strikes me as a guy that'll keep his job through the season, but if he struggles early on next season, he could be one of the first head coaches released or fired. But as far as this season, I think he's going to keep it, especially because of the injury to the starting running back and his starting quarterback getting a punctured lung, and uh, Herbert stepping in there being a guy who wasn't prepared to play, but they had to play him anyway. I just believe with all of the interesting situations surrounding that team that Lynn has an excuse to keep it at least through the season.
See, I disagree with you there, Tyler. I think that this season is actually going to determine whether or not Anthony Lynn returns as the coach. And it's for some of the same reasons that you think he's okay. He was steadfast at the beginning of the year that Tyrod Taylor was his quarterback, that it wasn't a placeholder. And even when Herbert came in, there was reports out of LA that there was pressure for him to make the move permanently to Herbert, because afterwards he was saying that no, when Tyrod Taylor's healthy and ready to come back, he's our starting quarterback. And you just see them time after time lose these games. And what I don't understand about the Chargers is they let Herbert open the ball up in the first half, and he is shredding teams. He is not playing like a rookie. And it's like they get a lead, and it's like, okay, we're going to go into a super ultrative conservative offense, and we're going to play prevent on defense. And I think if they can't start to turn that around and start winning some games, I think you might see a change here in order to maximize the potential of their new star rookie quarterback.
Definitely a good take there. I mean, I could see it going either way. He's definitely a guy that will be looked at closely in the offseason. But let's move on to a much better team and a head coach that is definitely not on the hot seat. He is just on fire, and that is Andy Reid and the Chiefs. Cody, give me a breakdown on the Chiefs.
I don't really have too much to say about the Chiefs. This one's pretty easy. The Chiefs are once again all in. They're right at the top of contenders in the AFC. I think the Chiefs are around this year, next year, maybe one more as top guys. The biggest thing against the Chiefs will always be health and how the salary cap runs out with all the potential pieces that they paid this offseason. But I think the Chiefs are in it this year. They'll be in it next year and probably the year after that.
Okay, Cody. So moving forward on this season, we definitely have to talk about the Chiefs' running backs against the Jets. I expected it to be a run-heavy game. I expected the Chiefs to take an early lead and just kind of run out the clock even before the half, and it ended up not being that at all. Both running backs, Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Le'Veon Bell, both got 6 carries each and didn't do much with it. Um, but it has to be concerning that a guy you draft in the first round in Clyde Edwards-Helaire had a 50-50 split at running back. If you are a fantasy owner of either of these running backs, what are you doing? Are you trading them? Are you panicking? Or are you starting them with confidence?
I'm going to try to move Clyde Edwards-Helaire if I can. I'm not going to give him away. I just think maybe someone who doesn't follow it as closely might be like still living on the preseason hype from him. I do think Le'Veon Bell makes an impact there, and I just think the Chiefs are one of those teams that there's so many weapons, and I mean, outside of Mahomes, Kelsey, and Hill, you never know which guy that week is going to be option number 3. Some weeks it's going to be Edwards-Helaire. Some weeks it's going to be McCole Hardman. Some weeks it'll be Brian Pringle out of nowhere. Um, so I don't think that you can rely on Clyde Edwards-Helaire as a mainstay in fantasy. You have to be flexible as always. But I'm still not going to give him away. For Le'Veon Bell, I thought this week was going to be his. I'm going to show everyone I still got it. Then I'm going to coast for a ring. Go play again next year. He didn't show everyone he still got it. Um, I don't even know if he needs to be owned in fantasy unless you want to keep him as a handcuff, because if Edwards goes down, he'll probably have an increased role. But the running backs in Kansas City do scare me.
One thing I want to say about Kansas City before we move on, I'm not a big proponent on, getting on a soapbox for the Rooney rule, but I will say this much, and I'm going to say it as much as I can throughout this season. If Eric Bieniemy is not a head coach next year in the NFL, there is a problem, because his creativity, and I know it's partially Andy Reid and he's learned from, some say, the master, but the creativity they have within that offense this guy deserves his chance at the helm of a team.
Absolutely agree. And I think he find his way down to Atlanta with that offense firepower in Atlanta. He could do some magical things down there. So Atlanta with Eric Bieniemy would be my favorite pick going into the offseason.
I like that.
Oh, Atlanta could have a quick rebuild turnaround if that happens. That offense is still way too potent. But let's finish off this division here and let's have Marcus talk a little bit about the state of the Raiders.
So I know we've talked about, categorizing teams as contenders, or rebuilding or pretenders. And, the Las Vegas Raiders coming off of a win against the Browns, and they actually have a pretty easy schedule the rest of the way, but I just don't buy it. I look at them as pretenders. The defense fails this team way too often. And it's hard to be a consistent, strong winning team when you have a streaky defense. And it's really hard to win when you're really just kind of making light of, the season that we have at hand. This is a very unique season, and whether we like it or not, COVID has become an integral part of the planning and preparation. And the Raiders kind of made that as a joke. You've, seen multiple reports of them going out without masks and going to, parties and clubs. At one point, their entire offensive line was quarantined. And then on top of it, accidentally pump air into one of your players' bloodstreams while giving him an IV. This organization just doesn't seem to be that well-oiled machine. And to kind of hit the home run point on that, I'm going to give you a name, Jalen Virgil. He plays for Appalachian State right now, and he's going to be my early prediction to be on the Raiders next year because he runs a 4.2. So that's going to be their next wide receiver that they're going to pair with Henry Ruggs because that seems to be the only thing the Raiders care about is speed. But yet then they have Derek Carr, who just I don't believe is consistent enough at quarterback to really take advantage of those types of players. So yeah, I just don't buy this team. I don't believe in it. Uh, Jacobs is the best thing going for them. And I just think you're going to see teams start to key down on the running game and force uh, Carr to beat them over the top. And I think Ruggs, although has looked impressive, I don't think he's at the point yet where he is the effective game changer that he alone will beat teams. So I think they're going to have a letdown of a second half of the season.
I don't know if Ruggs alone has to beat teams or alone has to take teams off of the running game, though, because unfortunately, as an Eagles fan, I get to watch Raiders games and watch the rebirth of Nelson Aguilar. But, I mean, I feel like they have the talent at receiver, Hunter Renfrow as well. Do you think it's play calling that's giving them an issue? Do you think it's Derek Carr? What do you think it is?
Well, it can't be play calling because the only play call they do there is Spider 2Y banana.
The best play of all time?
Best play of all time.
The only play,
Um,
honestly.
no, I think I think part of it is Derek Carr, but the best word to say, if you ask me to summarize the Raiders in one word, it's streaky. And you just don't see consistent performances outside of Jacobs week in and week out. And I think that is what is ultimately going to snake bite them throughout the second half of the season.
Yeah, I completely agree. As a Jacobs owner in a couple leagues, he's definitely on that streaky side. They're pretty much, does Ruggs hit a 70-yard touchdown, they're going to win the game. If he doesn't, they're not going to win the game. And you know how often that happens realistically. But that pretty much wraps up every division. So let's go through our final thoughts. We'll go around the room and pick who we think from this AFC will represent in the Super Bowl. And then if you have any thoughts about teams we talked about, feel free to start them out. And we'll start right with our special guest, Marcus. Why don't you go ahead?
So, Cody alluded to this earlier in kind of our preseason predictions. I was very high on the Indianapolis Colts, and I try and stick to my predictions and not, jump ship, but I just can't in good faith, stay with that franchise right now for all the reasons that were said earlier. There's just too many things that are a struggle for them right now, and it starts with Philip Rivers. Um, but who am I looking at? Well, I might be a little bit of the surprise here. I don't forecast the Chiefs getting to the championship game even this year. I think it's going to come down to the Pittsburgh Steelers, who I believe is the most complete team in the AFC, against, although things look a little bleak right now, the Tennessee Titans. And the reason why is the Tennessee Titans do this better than any other team, which is run the football. And at the end of the season in December, you're talking cold weather games, pounding the rock with Derrick Henry. It's how they got to the championship game last year. And I think this year is when they pull the Miracle, Music City Miracle story. They bring it to relevance because I think the Tennessee Titans this year are going to make it to the Super Bowl.
I love it. I would love to see it, obviously, as a Titans fan, but even
I'm
as a
sure you do, Tyler.
even non-biased, I really do like the pick. I know I talked about all the struggles the Titans are having, but one of the main struggles was secondary, and they are getting their number one corner in Adoree Jackson back. Malcolm Butler has been one of the best corners in the NFL the last few weeks. If you actually look at the stats, he held um, Chase Claypool to one catch for -2 yards and held AJ Green to just two catches for 19 yards. And now they got the new acquisition from the trade, Desmond King. I think that their secondary takes a step forward. And if they can really, figure those defensive problems out, they really do have a great offense. It's hard to stop A.J. Brown. It's hard to stop Derrick Henry. And Ryan Tannehill deserves to be in the conversation for MVP if he continues to play as well as he has. The Titans only lost to the Steelers by 3 points, and that's with the defensive struggles we were having. So I love your pick, Marcus. I think it's a very good pick. But George, I'm curious to hear who you have. I know you were a big Bills supporter coming into the season. Are you still on the Bills train?
As Marcus said, I think it's good to at least take a look at your preseason pick and see what you think about them making that run to the Super Bowl still. And I still see it within the range of outcomes for the Bills to be able to get there. I think, like Marcus had kind of said about the Titans and them being able to grind out games, the Bills are going to have to do that. They still have to have Josh Allen turn around a little bit. I know I talked about them earlier, but Zach Moss needs to become more ingrained in that offense. They have to be able to ground and pound. And that defense has so many good players, and they talked about them making so many good plays in the clutch last year. If they can get people like Ed Oliver, Jerry Hughes, Matt Milano, they can get Josh Norman's feet back on the ground. I think they can make enough plays to have a chance against teams like Tennessee, Kansas City, Pittsburgh. The only thing that scares me is if they have to beat all three of them back to back to back, that's a tough gauntlet to go through. But I think it's within the range of outcomes. I think the Bills could represent the AFC in the Super Bowl.
I like the Bills pick there. I was another, big supporter of them coming into the season. However, they just make me nervous right now with how they're playing. I'm going to have to see a turnaround from them to have to trust them. But guys, my pick is the obvious one. I'm going with the Kansas City Chiefs to make the Super Bowl again. Uh, they're just too dominant for me. Andy Reid is one of the smartest head coaches in the NFL. Patrick Mahomes is arguably the best quarterback of our generation. I'm willing to say that already in his career. And then on top of that, you have Derrick Henry, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Le'Veon Bell, Travis Kelce, Mecole Hardman. I can go on because guys just keep stepping up week after week. And on top of it, their defense looks good. Their defense is performing very well. And I just don't see anybody in the AFC able to put a stop to the Chiefs' reign right now.
I think you make a good point with the Chiefs' defense. I think their defense is playing better than last year when they did win it all. But I think winning it all back-to-back years is a lot harder. It doesn't happen very often. So I'm going to go with the other defense that looks incredible in the Pittsburgh Steelers as my team. I think will win the Super Bowl, or not win the Super Bowl, but represent the AFC in the Super Bowl. Um, the only thing that scares me is I know at halftime they were looking at Roethlisberger's arm again. So if he starts to creep up with some arm issues, we saw how that hurt him in years past. But if Pittsburgh continues playing at the same level, or even if it dips a little bit because of how well they're playing right now, I think they have a pretty easy path to the Super Bowl.
I think one thing to note with all of our picks here too, something that's different this year, now that there is a third wild card team, that number one seed is more important this year than any other season prior because they're the only team that's going to come out of this with an actual bye.
It is important to note also, though, with these COVID situations, the NFL has talked about making the playoffs 8 teams this year, and that means that that first round bye would disappear, and the first overall pick would probably play someone they beat, but they would still have to play a game in the first week of the playoffs.
Yeah.
However, you got to note last year. I know I talked about Lamar Jackson being, struggling to throw the football when he needs to, but at the same time, I really think having that first round bye hurt the Ravens a lot last year. I think mainly because they were so entrenched as the top seed, they benched their starters in Week 17 and then had that first round bye. And they had 2 weeks off. The Titans were fresh off of playing, and I think it hurt them, throwing them out of a rhythm. So sometimes that first round bye is actually a little overhyped, in my opinion.
I think you make a great point with the sitting week 17 and then going on a bye, so 2 weeks off. I agree. I think it was definitely against the Ravens last year when they did it, and we've seen it happen in the past. Um, so if you have the first round bye, I'd still play people at least a little bit week 17. But I think that wraps up all our AFC previews for the rest of the season, our thoughts, where we think each team is headed. So let's transition into a little bit more of a fun exercise. We're all huge fantasy players. So let's redraft the first round if we were starting in week 9. So we randomize the order. We'll each have 3 picks. We're not building a team. We are acting as a GM that would have each of the pick number that we're at. So the first pick goes to Tyler. I think it's pretty obvious, but where are you going?
It is obvious. I'm going with Nathan Peterman, the backup quarterback for the Las Vegas Raiders. He throws 5 picks a game. He's just a phenomenal quarterback at being terrible. He's okay. In all seriousness, though, I'm going Alvin Kamara. He has been so electric this year, both in the passing game and the run game. I just don't think that there's another fantasy player that is on the same level as Kamara this year. There's some players that are close, but no one quite reaches him. If we had to redraft, I'd have to go Kamara first overall. The thing about him is he had so many contract issues right around the time we were drafting. So even though he was originally ranked around the third overall player, he fell to the end of the first round in plenty of drafts. So he was a steal at this point. We would not make that mistake again. Camaro number 1.
All right, number 2, I'm going to take Dalvin Cook. Now that his injuries are hopefully behind him, he's just been absolutely phenomenal. He put up almost 50 points. I mean, I guess depending on your scoring, he put up 50 points last week. And he is the only person that's within sonar range of Derrick Henry in the rushing yards race. I think Dalvin Cook gets more catches. Most of the time we're talking PPR when it comes to these formats. And even yet, he's still been outscoring Derrick Henry, scoring more touchdowns. I think you got to go Dalvin Cook number 2.
I like it. Marcus, number 3.
So I think I'm taking the player that George was also considering, at least, or at least he talked about. And I'm going to go with King Henry. Look, the guy is currently leading the NFL in rushing right now, plus 700 yards. And as we've seen every year he's been in the league, if there is a second half player in the National Football League, it is Derrick Henry. This guy absolutely has the potential to rush for 2,000 yards this year. And I don't see, again, it's cold weather. It's his time to shine. And I don't really see defenses able to stop him. He's proved that over and over again. I'd be happy to take him there as a manager and start my team with a very safe, reliable number 1 running back.
That is also a great pick. I'm on the clock at number 4. I think the first 3 picks were pretty easy, and I think 4, like most fantasy drafts, even in the offseason, is where things get a little hectic or a little back and forth. I'm debating between 2 players here, And it's going to come down to the fact that the one player is still has a little bit of an injury. I don't think he'll be back this week, but I think he'll be fine the rest of the season. So I'm not going to take him, and I'm actually going to take our first wide receiver here with Devontae Adams. Now, a lot of people will be like, "You got to take running backs," but I think we've seen with Adams and Rodgers the points they're going to put up, the amount of targets the touchdowns he scores, the target share, and that the fact that the Packers didn't add a wide receiver at the trade deadline makes Adams probably the safest play in all of fantasy.
That's crazy because he fell to the second round in some, drafts at the beginning of the year. To see him taken fourth overall now just goes to show you how much people can get it wrong.
All right, well, I am now on the clock, and if you think it's crazy that Devontae Adams, who fell to the second round, is drafted in the first round, then you're gonna flip your lid from my pick. I'm going with a guy that was a free agent pickup in almost every league. If anybody drafted them in the first round, you are an absolute genius, and you're lying. I am going with James Robinson, the running back from the Jaguars. Now, I understand he might not be the flashiest name, but the guy gets volume. Even when the Jaguars are losing, they are still handing the ball off to him. They're still throwing the ball to him. He has been one of the most exciting free agent pickups I have ever seen. James Robinson is a fantastic fantasy running back.
Pick 6 puts me back on the clock, and I'm actually going to go with the guy that Cody was referring to taking at pick 4. He was the pretty much consensus number 1 overall pick to start this year, and he's pretty much back from the injury. I'm going to go with Christian McCaffrey. I know there's some worries about him losing some volume to Mike Davis, but Christian McCaffrey has been way too good to keep off the field and keep off your fantasy team. You're never going to see him fall to 6th in an actual draft, but just because of the injury, you're going to see him fall this far. He's going to finish off the season strong. The Panthers are contenders. They're going to be feeding him, trying to win games to get into the playoffs. Give me McCaffrey.
Marcus, you are on the clock.
So I'm going to go with a guy who I wish I had shares of this year. I have none, but he just proves to be, again, that reliable running back, and it's on a revamped team. It just goes to show you how much Pittsburgh missed Roethlisberger last year. I'm going to take James Conner. Um, he has shown consistency. He's finding the end zone. He's that receiving threat out of the backfield. And again, looking in a first round, what you want is somebody that you can build your team around reliability wise. And we know how sparse running backs are in 2020. That's a pretty sweet spot to get him there at number 7.
Yeah, that's a great pick there, Marcus. I'm not going to lie. Connor wasn't even on my radar, but listening to you talk about it, I was like, definitely missed out on that one. So thankfully, this isn't a real draft, or I'd have been pretty upset. But I'm going to go with a running back this time. And George, it is not the guy I was thinking about because I'm going to take him now. I was not thinking about McCaffrey then. I was actually thinking about the other Green Bay Packer and Aaron Jones. I think this will be the last week he misses with the calf injury. We saw him come on strong last year, and he's continued it through this season. It's pretty much the Jones and Adams show there in Green Bay. So give me Aaron Jones at the 8th overall spot in our redraft.
All right, Cody, you were definitely the homer with your first 2 picks of Adams and Connor, or Adams and Jones. However, they are great picks. I'm going to change it up a little bit. I understand there are some good running backs still available. There are some amazing receivers still available for sure. But I'm actually going to go with the tight end. I'm going with Travis Kelce. Now, guys, tight end is one of the most frustrating positions as a fantasy owner to try and solve. Some of the top 5 tight ends in the league still give you 2 points a week. And then you look at a guy like George Kittle, who is usually right up there with Kelce, and now he's lost for the season. There's nothing like having a guy like Travis Kelce on your team. If you can have that one position giving you 25 points that everybody else is getting 2 points from every week, Travis Kelce just becomes such an asset, such a game changer. I think he has to be a first round pick if you redraft.
Yeah, I think you talk a lot about value added in terms of when you're drafting, and a lot of times we steer away from, positions like tight end in the first round because you can find comparable later on. I think Tyler has a great point there. There is no comparable at this point anymore. With Kittle being out, no one else is really stepping up. Kelsey is just far and beyond the best tight end available for the rest of the season.
And I mean, I don't even think it's just talking tight end, which that's very true. There's no comparable anymore. I know the next 5 guys on my board are they're kind of toss-ups and they all have question marks. We're kind of getting down to that part where if you can get somebody that's solid, you take it. I'm going to go wide receiver here later in the first round. You normally see some of them go. We obviously already had Devontae Adams go. I'm going to go bold and take Michael Thomas. Michael Thomas is the consensus number 1 receiver coming into this season. He should be working back from injury, if not this week, in the next 2 weeks. And there's no doubt when he comes back to New Orleans in a playoff chase, he's going to be a valuable asset to not only them, but your fantasy team. So I'm going to go Michael Thomas, a little bit bold here.
Interesting. Definitely bold, especially knowing now that he's going to miss so many weeks. Not taking a guy like Ridley, Hopkins, Metcalf, any of those other solid receivers that have put up the points, but have also have potential to put up those level of points the rest of the season. Definitely a bold choice with Michael Thomas there, George.
All right, we got Marcus with pick 11, 2 picks left in the first round. Go ahead, Marcus.
So Tyler just brought this guy up. Surprisingly, I think this is more wide receivers than anybody saw in the first round of their actual fantasy drafts this year. But I do think that this guy is ready to take the next step. And I think he already has shown this year how dominant of a force he is. And with the exception of one game, and the quarterback came out afterwards and said that he should have gotten him more involved, and it just happens to be their only loss. Yep, I'm talking about one DK Metcalf, the freak amongst freaks. If the NFL is full of freaks, he is the freakiest of them. DK Metcalf, I think, is going to hands down be a lock for the first round in 2021.
The only thing I don't really love about DK is it seems like him and Tyler Lockett seem to alternate amazing weeks. And I won't lie, on my board, they were near the top as well. And I literally had it written as Lockett/DK. I didn't know who to pick.
I know in the draft when Seattle took DK, he was available at the Titans pick, and I was praying that they would get him because can you imagine a team that has both Derrick Henry and DK Metcalf on the offense? Talk about freaky and talk about scary.
At this point, Tyler, I think any team who's passed on DK Metcalf is wishing they would have taken him.
No,
Very true.
JJ Arthega-Whiteside.
Eagles.
I promise that wasn't a dig at the.
Eagles suck at
All righty,
drafting.
well, that they do. But luckily I don't, and I have the 12th pick, the last pick of our first round. I wish we could go longer. I'm debating a few people here. Since the last pick, I'll just talk it out with you guys. I'm debating some guys that have a little bit of an injury with like a Chris Carson. He was putting up great numbers before his injury. We talked about the inconsistencies with Josh Jacobs earlier. And we also talked about DeAndre Hopkins as the top wide receiver. And then you can't forget about the guys. I don't think any of us will actually take him, but you can't forget about Zeke. He was a top 4 pick. Obviously, they've had many injuries there in Dallas, but he still sees the volume, and he'll probably get in the end zone a few times, so he could be worth a pick in the second round. But I like wide receivers, so I'm going to take DeAndre Hopkins here. It was close between him and Josh Jacobs for me. Luckily, if you were in a real draft, you'd have 12 and 13, so you could take Jacobs right next there. But I'm going to take DeAndre Hopkins to wrap up our fantasy draft. So a quick rundown. Our order went Alvin Kamara, Dalvin Cook, Derrick Henry, Devontae Adams, James Robinson, Christian McCaffrey, James Conner, Aaron Jones, Travis Kelce, Michael Thomas, DK Metcalf, and DeAndre Hopkins. Guys, I think that's a pretty good first round. Any picks you would change, don't like going forward with this first round?
No, I think you brought up a good point, Cody. The next closest person there I thought would be Josh Jacobs. And like you said, if you're in a real draft, you're able to grab him in the first pick in the second round. Everyone else that you're looking at, you're dealing with, possible injury issues. So
I think if it wasn't for the question marks surrounding him, I think Clyde Edwards-Helaire would still be a first-round pick if it wasn't for Bell coming there. Zeke is definitely still an interesting case. I mean, we know what he's capable of, but without Dak Prescott there, we have seen the decline of him. I'm actually really surprised that Calvin Ridley was not higher on anybody's boards. He has been pretty much the number one receiver all season long up until he got hurt. He did have 1 week of zero, but every other week he's been dominant and consistent. I'm surprised he wasn't on there, but yeah, I think it was a pretty good first round personally.
Yeah, Tyler, I considered him, but I think you brought it up that the unknown with the current injury is what dropped him out of my first round.
I think that and the resurgence of seeing a little bit more Julio Jones, people kind of think that you can't have two top 15 receivers in the same offense. And most of the time it's not true, even though I think it could be for that offense. That kind of kept him off my board. I think the next guys that I was looking at would have been Josh Jacobs, Chris Carson, and Zeke Elliott.
Alrighty. Well, I think that will do it for this episode. So thanks again for listening to the Couch GMs podcast. And thanks again for Marc D for joining us from the First and 10 Club. Marcus, why don't you let the listeners know where they can find your stuff one more time?
Guys, thanks for having me on. It was a blast. You guys can find my shows Tuesday and Thursday. Tuesdays we do a week recap, and Thursdays we do our picks and predictions and kind of player rankings. And you can find that at Marc D on YouTube or the First and 10 Club. Just search it either on Twitter or on YouTube to find our shows.
And to all you listeners out there, there's a little bit of Couch GMs in all of us, so please get involved. Let us know your take on some of these teams. Did we mess up? Did we say somebody's a contender when they're really a pretender? Is there somebody else that you would have taken in the first round of the fantasy redraft? Let us know. We are always interested on you guys getting involved. It makes it more fun for us and more fun for you by getting involved.
And guys, you saw we talked about the AFC this episode. We're going to be talking about the NFC coming up shortly, so keep an eye out for part 2 of our mid-season reviews. And for Tyler Snyder, Cody Roadcap, and Marc D, I am George Kerth, and we will see you all soon.